Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's time for another video game buyer's guide, and today we're finally talking about the Nintendo Ultra 64 Project Reality 64-bit video game console. It's just the Nintendo 64, shorthand N64, but it had a lot of code names. So let's talk about it. Where does the Nintendo 64 come from? Well, the short, and this is the abridged version. Nintendo and Sony were planning a CD-ROM upgrade for the Super NES, which they dubbed the PlayStation, 2 words, Play Space Station. Due to some legal shenanigans, the two companies parted ways. Sony released the PlayStation, 1 word, PlayStation, on their own as a 32-bit 3D powerhouse in 1994 in Japan and worldwide in 1995. And it became a phenomenally successful machine. Nintendo, quickly realizing that they were going to have stiff competition from a company that had been a former partner of theirs, the same company that had designed the sound chip for the SNES, among other things. They'd made software for the Super Nintendo under the Sony ImageSoft brand. I'm getting tongue-tied. Nintendo did dabble in primitive virtual reality technology and 3D graphics at the time. They had Star Fox running on the SNES using the Super FX chip, and a handful of other late entry Super Nintendo games also running on the Super FX chip. Nintendo was starting to realize that they too were going to have to shift to 3D gaming, and there was nothing they could do about it. They experimented with different technologies on the SNES, using pre-rendered CGI over flat sprites for the Donkey Kong Country series, using Mode 7 to simulate a 3D environment in F-Zero and Super Mario Kart. The aforementioned Star Fox 64 being fully polygonal 3D rendered, although fairly primitive at the time. Even at the time, it was primitive by what we were seeing in arcades and on computers. But it was still impressive enough for being on the SNES. And then you had fully rendered but also pre-rendered pseudo 3D, 3.5D top-down 3 3/4 view Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars, which looked like it could have been a PlayStation game had it been given a little polish and a little extra beef in the hardware. So the Super Nintendo was prepping Nintendo gamers for the 3D revolution, because Sega was going 3D, dabbling with it on the Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, going in whole hog on the Saturn. PlayStation was coming full force in 3D. Nintendo had to get their shit together. And they did. They created a machine that was, at the time, technologically impressive on so many levels, considering they were able to make a machine that was that visually, graphically impressive for the price point for a home console, doing things that only supercomputers could do at the time. Not even your desktop computers could do what the Nintendo 64 could do at launch. Now home computers quickly caught up and then surpassed N64 tech, but that's the way of the business. But in September 1996, when the N64 hit the market, it was the most technologically advanced gaming computer hardware on the market at the time. Didn't last long, but that's neither here nor there. Now, the Nintendo 64 had a whole bunch of bells and whistles on the inside. Z buffering, texture mapping, MIP mapping polygons, things like that. A bunch of buzzwords. Nobody knew what the fuck they meant, but we fell for it. Raw horsepower, it could push considerably more polygons per second than the Sony PlayStation or Sega Saturn. And it had a much faster CPU and stronger GPU. And more RAM than both of those systems. And upgradable RAM, which would come into play down the road. The Nintendo 64 was also fairly innovative, being the first successful mainstream home console, caveats, to feature 4 controller ports. Other consoles previously had 4 controller ports built in, but they were commercial flops. The Nintendo 64 also had a unique controller that was designed specifically with 3D games in mind. It was a 3-pronged controller that had a D-pad on the left prong, face buttons on the right prong, and an analog joystick in the middle prong. It had a Z trigger on the bottom of the middle prong, and shift buttons, L and R, on the top of the controller, just like the SNES did. So, pretty innovative for the time, and it also had an expansion slot that could be used for various expansions like Rumble Pack, memory cards, and even a Game Boy reader that was used for like 1 or 2 games, and other things. So you had a lot. The N64 had a lot of hardware packed in, and it had a lot of technological advantages over its competitors at launch. That being said, the elephant in the room, the Nintendo 64 had one huge, unavoidable, unmistakable drawback that we have to talk about. Nintendo's insistence on limiting it to a cartridge medium rather than CD-ROM. Now, we're not going to go down the CD versus cartridge debate. We're just going to say it did impact games that were released for the console, it did impact sales, and it did impact things that you could do on the games that were released for the console. We don't have to get into the nitty-gritty, debating merits of what would have been, what could have been, what should have been. We can only work with what was given to us, and what was given to us was a cartridge that held infinitely less information than the CD-ROM that was on the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. This cost Nintendo some high-profile games that otherwise would have been exclusives to the machine. Most notably, Final Fantasy VII, which actually was in development for the N64, and a demo was shown off for it at conventions, and then it was migrated to the PlayStation because they needed the extra space for the CD-ROM capacity to tell the story they wanted to tell. Because it took 3 discs. You couldn't have multiple cartridges. You couldn't sell 6 cartridges at $75 a piece. No one would have bought the game. That'd have been a $500 game. No, decisions were made for whatever reason, for better or worse, it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean we didn't get a great console. We did. That doesn't mean we didn't get great games. We did. Super Mario 64 is one of the greatest video games of all time. Hands down, the greatest 3D platformer of all time. Probably one of the most important 3D games of all time. And the list goes on. You can add so many adjectives to Super Mario 64 that end with the greatest of all time. And you had other phenomenally mega popular, fantastic games. Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time was a tremendously successful game. You had Mortal Kombat 4, which was a really good arcade port. You had Killer Instinct Gold, which nobody played, but it existed. And then you had the games that started in the arcades in a previous attempt by Nintendo to get the hardware developed. Partnering with Midway, they produced the aforementioned Killer Instinct with Rareware, which was running on an early draft of the hardware, as was Cruisin' USA and later Cruisin' World. Those games even featured the Ultra 64 logo in their attract mode screens in the arcades, because that was what they were calling it at the time. Now, when those games were ported to the finished Nintendo 64, it was running on considerably modified hardware. Those were still good, fantastic games. Other big hits and fantastic games. You had Star Fox 64, a proper 3D rendered upgrade, pseudo remaster remake of the first SNES game. You had Mario Kart 64, again, a proper 3D rendered 4-player, fully 3D environment, pretty good looking game, pretty awesome gameplay at the time, version of Super Mario Kart. You had the immensely popular board game series that were all fully 3D rendered, Mario Party 2, and Mario Party 3. And you had countless other big hits like Donkey Kong Country 64, Diddy Kong Racing. You had Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. You had GoldenEye 007, immensely popular, fully 3D rendered game. You had Conker's Bad Fur Day, another example. And then you had Smash Brothers, which kind of came out of left field. And then you had the pseudo 2D, pseudo 3D Paper Mario, which was a spiritual successor to Super Mario RPG, but not completely related to it at all. You had a shit ton of mostly awesome racing games. You had a shit ton of mostly well-designed, well-received professional wrestling games. You had a fairly adequate offering of your standard professional sports games for the time. Madden, FIFA, NBA, etc., hockey, all the big sports were all there. And you had Mario sports games like tennis and golf, which were heavy hitters. The Nintendo 64 was a well-received game console among die-hard Nintendo aficionados, myself included. But it failed to capture the previous success Nintendo had seen with the SNES, Super Famicom, and the NES and the Famicom in Japan. It wasn't a total failure, but it wasn't a total success story either. It had roughly just shy of 300 games, give or take, depending on how you count, released in North America, and an additional 100 or so games released exclusive to Japan, and 4 or 5 games that were released exclusive to the European market, the PAL market, for a grand total of plus or minus 500 games. Not your standard Nintendo output. Most Nintendo game consoles have 700-800 games in one region alone. So, not their best. Not the worst thing they've ever done, but not their best. Now, the Nintendo 64 had mega hits like Ocarina of Time, the aforementioned Mario 64, Diddy Kong Racing, etc. And it had lesser known titles, but not as many as you were used to. It didn't have hardly any indie fare, because indie developers really couldn't afford to make games on the N64 because it was very expensive tech at the time that Nintendo was willing to bet on. And not the hardest to develop of the three, but not the easiest to develop for of the three. Easier to develop games for the 64 than the Saturn, but harder to make games for it than the PlayStation, which saw tremendously, astronomically high numbers of releases of games on the PlayStation. Over 2,000 games worldwide released for the Sony PlayStation in the 13 or so years it was on the market. Barely 500 games in the roughly 4.5 years that the N64 was technically on the market, before it was quietly swept under the rug for the technologically superior but not as successful GameCube. It is what it is. But still, the Nintendo 64 is very fondly remembered And it has some great games. I'll admit to that. Loads of great games. My issue with it at the time remains my issue with it today, which is the single-player games aren't all that great. There are some good ones, but it's very heavily a multi-platform, multiplayer console. And if you don't have friends to play with, and local friends to play with, and you don't have multiple expensive controllers, you're kind of limited. Yeah, you had Mario 64. You had Donkey Kong. You had Star Fox. You had some heavy hitters, but they were few and far between. And you had a lot of games in between that didn't live up to the potential. Who's it for? Who's it for? Well, almost everybody who wants to play video games. Honestly, you really have no excuse to not want to play Nintendo 64 games. I'm being real with you. I have a Nintendo 64. I have the emulator. And I have had, past tense, the games on my Switch, Wii, and Wii U. And I have a couple of them on my Nintendo DS. The Nintendo 64 legit does have some great games. It actually absolutely does. And some of those games are so revolutionary that they still hold up to this day, and we wouldn't have a lot of the games we have today had those games not been what they were. Or it would have taken a little bit longer to get there had Nintendo not done it first. And done it best. You know, if Ocarina of Time hadn't been the phenomenal masterpiece it was, we probably wouldn't have got Skyrim or Final Fantasy 13. And if Nintendo hadn't stabbed the studio that would become Rockstar in the back, they wouldn't have set out to make Grand Theft Auto the single most important video game franchise in the past 30 years. So yeah, Nintendo definitely did some good things, and they did some not so good things. But you should still experience the N64 in all its glory. Fortunately for us, the system wasn't a total flop, which means it's not ultra super rare, which means it's not super expensive. Also, because it was a Nintendo machine, physical hardware still runs relatively well today, so getting your hands on a working N64 is not going to break the bank, and it's not an impossible feat. Getting your hands on working, authentic Nintendo-manufactured N64 controllers, on the other hand, not going to happen. Those joysticks broke. You could replace them. You could repair them. But most people went the third-party route. Or today we go the aftermarket route because that's the best route. Just as good, but let's be real. You're going to pay a little bit more for a proper Nintendo-manufactured, authentic, licensed, first-party N64 controllers. Because they're durable, but rare. Because while the controller was durable, the flimsy-ass joystick was not. So if you get one, you're either going to get it at a little bit more price than you're used to paying for a controller, or you're going to have to get it repaired. Eventually. It ain't going to last forever. Good luck getting 4 of them in working condition. That's where they get you. And I mean the aftermarket scalpers, but also that's where Nintendo got you too. You want to play Mario Kart with 3 friends? Well, you got to pay $50-$60 a pop for those controllers. It might have been $30-$40 a pop. I don't remember the exact, but they were not cheap. They weren't $15-$20 a pop like you were used to. They were the first expensive extra controllers that you had to buy for a game console. Now, controller prices went up and up and up as game console generations went along, but that's neither here nor there. But they were expensive at the time, and they're still expensive today. Now, that being said, fortunately, for the vast majority of the games you're going to want to play, Ocarina of Time, Mario 64, Mario Kart, Smash Brothers, etc., you've got viable options elsewhere. Emulation is imperfect. I have to stress imperfect, but it's doable. You have at least 3 or 4 various main Nintendo 64 emulators that have various degrees of compatibility with different games. All in all, if you mix and match emulators and you tinker with the settings and add-ons and upgrades and etc., you should be able to get any game you want to play on the Nintendo 64 working on the emulator. And again, the heavy hitters are all available sort of on modern consoles or modern-ish consoles. Some of them were ported to the DS. A couple of them were ported to the GameCube. Many of them were released on the Virtual Console for the Wii and the Wii U, and a handful of them are available today through the Nintendo Switch Online on the Nintendo Switch. There are actually a robust scene of fully functional, fully compatible aftermarket retro clones that will play physical N64 cartridges that are actually well designed. It's one of those systems that actually did get a really good, robust aftermarket scene. Because, it only sold about 30 to 35 million units total worldwide, depending on which source you reference. But that's still a lot. That's not the worst. That's better than the original Xbox. That's better than the Xbox One. Probably better than the Xbox Series. So, yeah, not a total flop by any stretch of the imagination. And for the most part, I have to stress this, the software you're going to want to play on the Nintendo 64 physical cartridges are relatively affordable compared to other game consoles of the time, especially the Saturn. Now, that's not to say there aren't a handful of, I'd say 5 or 6, give or take, hella expensive, ultra rare titles per region on the Nintendo 64 that are going to be difficult to come by unless you're going to shell out the bucks. But if you got the money, they're still, for the most part, legitimately worth it. It's not shit like Action 52 that's expensive because it's rare. No, they're actual good games, with one exception I would say probably not, and that's the Clay Fighter game that's ultra rare, which it's like, just play the regular version. It's the same fucking game, or emulate it. You don't need to spend $700 on a Nintendo 64 cartridge. I mean, maybe you do. Maybe you do, but the average gamer doesn't. Is all I'm saying. Who should buy a Nintendo 64 and or experience the software? Everybody. Literally every gamer who's ever gamed should play Nintendo 64 games. At least the big 5, Mario Kart, Smash Brothers, Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, those are the big ones. And then Star Fox, I guess. Those are like the ones that everybody should probably play. But there's so many other games. Paper Mario's great. Kirby 64 is pretty good. Diddy Kong Racing has a following. Turok is pretty good. Doom is pretty good. There's a lot of really good games on the system. It's not all bad. The Star Wars games are all legit good. Like, literally every Star Wars game on the system is legit good. So there's a lot of good games to play on the N64. I didn't play it as much as my PlayStation back in the day when I got them side by side on my 18th birthday. But that's primarily because the software droughts. Nintendo was releasing like 3 or 4 games a year, spaced out every 3 months. It's like, alright, I got this game, now I gotta wait 3 months to play another game. This game ain't gonna hold me over for 3 months. I'm gonna go play some Tekken 3, or some Vigilante 8, or maybe some, I don't know, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater or something else, or Final Fantasy 7 or something on the PlayStation. Tetris Plus, or anything else while I'm waiting for the big hits to come to the 64. Now your big multi-platform games that were on everything, most of them came to the Nintendo 64. If it was on everything. But there were still quite a few multi-platforms that were exclusive to the 32-bit CD-ROM systems that were on PlayStation and Saturn that didn't make their way to the Nintendo 64. This is just something you're going to have to wrestle with. Now, you're also going to have to decide if a game was multi-platform, if it was on PlayStation and N64, which version are you going to want to get? Is the N64 version good enough? Or are you going to look for a different version? It just depends on the game. And it literally depends on the game. Some of them, the 64 version is better. Mortal Kombat 4 is an example. Some of them, the PlayStation version is better. Resident Evil 2, Mortal Kombat Trilogy are examples. Some of them, they're basically indistinguishable. Madden, Tony Hawk's, the aforementioned Vigilante 8. You're good either way. But you're here for the Nintendo software and the second-party Rareware games. And they're all legit good. Nintendo didn't really make a bad game for the Nintendo 64. They made some games that disappointed fans or missed the mark. And a lot of the big franchises are missing from the N64. Like, I would say from the time, your biggest franchise that was missing is Metroid. But you had other games that would have probably scratched that itch, like Jet Force Gemini is an example. Probably would have been a good substitute for a Metroid game because they weren't on the game console. But it is what it is. So, yeah. I think that's all you need to know about the Nintendo 64. They're not going to break the bank. The games are easy to pick up and play. They're easy to come by. And they're fairly accessible in various forms today. So you have no excuse to not be playing Super Mario 64, goddammit.